This is Miriam. Morning, everybody. Very excited for this class.
I saw someone had the Olam Chesed Yibaneh sign from Shul as their
as their background.
Yeah. I was inspired by that sign to I used that 3-word phrase to explain to my Intro to Hebrew Bible class how complicated it is to translate biblical Hebrew into English.
Yeah. What is that chesed word, huh? What are we building? So I'm excited for this. I apologize for the wait. I'm guessing there'll be a few more people who come on. And one of the and we are recording today. So one of the reasons that that I'm here, and I apologize, I'm not able to say the whole time. I'll let Barry, Dr. Wimpfheimer, introduce himself, but I have actually been at Shabbat dinner with Dr. David Weiss Halivni, and been very, very special for me. And in fact, 2 of his sons, Ephraim and Shai, are looking forward. Ephraim lives in Israel and will be landing here in America very shortly, so he can't be on right now, but are looking forward to hearing this as well in the recording. So Barry, we're excited for you. It really matters what you're teaching and what we're learning.
Thank you for that. So Paul, I see that you have to leave a little early. I'm not seeing videos for Jacqueline and Janet, but they might not want to share videos. That's okay. I just wanted people to have a level of experience that is commensurate with what their intention is. So, and I think you guys all know each other. I certainly recognize Douglas, Paul, Riva, and Morton from previous classes like this. So, are we ready to jump in? And Marcy, how much time do we have today?
12:15, I think we end it. Is that accurate? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So, Riva?
Unmute.
Yeah, Riva.
Helene has been in the hospital and is in rehab. I don't know if you know that. Helene Rosenberg. So she would be here, absolutely. But and she would be here even though she's in rehab, but she probably has PT or OT or something going on, who knows. So she's sorry that she's missing, I'm sure.
Yeah, and she's one of the reasons we're also recording. So
yeah.
Yes, Helene is responsible for my teaching. Every time I come, it's because Helene pursues me and follows up when I ignore an email or two, and corners me in the minyan when I see her. So yeah, we're definitely thinking of her. And when she watches the recording, we will wish her a refuah shlema already on the recording. Okay, so let me try to do this now. I was mentioning before that my computer's acting a little funny today. I'm going to be sharing a screen. Okay, are we seeing the screen that I shared?
Not yet.
Not yet.
it's black.
It says your screen share,
it says your screen share is loading.
Okay, that may be the issue.
it says you have started screen sharing, but nothing has appeared except that message.
Let me stop the share. It shouldn't used to happen. Oh yeah. Are we there? Are we back?
Yeah, and we're here. Can you hear us?
I can. This had me with a work thing.
Is it something you can send to one of us and we can share?
I am back. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
We
you're
can hear you
fine.
now.
You're
Yep.
fine. I never lost your your image. Maybe it's just screen layout, but
Wow. I was definitely kicked out. But I'm switching my PowerPoint from the web-based version, which I was using before, to now a desktop version. That should solve the problem.
yes.
But unfortunately, my computer, as I mentioned, for some reason I was late to join because my computer was taking a long time this morning. I guess it's Friday and my computer feels that too. I'm not gonna be, I mean, if I have to, I could do this without the PowerPoint too. I do have a text to share that I will want to share in some other way. Oh, geez.
Well,
Wow.
give it a
See if
go.
it works, and if not, you could send it to one of us and we could share for you.
Yeah.
Rick, are you able to hear us? Yeah,
No problem.
okay.
And see you.
Okay, I think I'll be able to do it now. Jeez. My computer is really not interested in letting me do this.
Barry,
Okay.
one of the choices might be for you to drop out of the meeting and reboot and then come back in again.
So I actually, on my end, I did that already.
We got it now.
Got it
Okay, does
now.
that, you guys see it now?
Yes,
Yep.
we do.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is the two-part series is called Anonymity and Annihilation. I like the assonance and the alliteration of the title, which I will make more explicit. I will clarify as we go through the two classes that I have in mind today and next week. I see we've been joined by some people. Welcome to those who joined us. You haven't missed anything. We've just been dealing with technical difficulties, so we're really starting now. When Helene reached out to me to teach for Bethlehem at this time, it was shortly after my teacher, Rabbi Dr. David Weiss Halivni, my professor at Columbia, had passed away. I had already agreed, I think, to speak to the Chicago Board of Rabbis about his work, and I thought that it would be valuable for me and hopefully for you to do a couple of sessions on some of the aspects of my teacher, some of which don't seem to work together. And one of the questions I'm going to be trying to reach towards in the two-part series is, how do we hold together his different legacies? Because intellectually and religiously, he left behind a number of legacies. And in some ways, they don't seem like they fit with each other. And I'd like to think a little bit about what they might have in common or how they might have fueled one another. So just a little bit about Professor Halivni's biography. You saw on the previous slide that it said that he was born in 1927. We actually don't know when he was born. His family doesn't really know because there aren't really records of his birth. He was born in Siget, which is in Transylvania. I've given you an image of it on the slide. You can see exactly where it is. It's today it would be in Romania. Back then it was, it was originally part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was, it's culturally, certainly, it seemed like a part of Hungary. And he grew up with Yiddish as his primary language. He grew up in a small village with no indoor plumbing, really kind of old world stuff. I used to marvel sometimes at I used to sometimes when I would sit with him. So I was a student of his in graduate school. I went to Columbia for my PhD. I was there between 2000 and 2005. It was a period of time where Halivni was already very well established and very well known, and had published his memoirs, which I have the Book and the Sword is his memoir that I have an image of in the top left corner of this slide. He was already quite well known as a Talmud scholar, as a noted memoirist, Holocaust survivor, as a theologian. He was known also for his somewhat controversial position at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He left the Jewish Theological Seminary at the time that they ordained women.
Is that why he left? Because he was against that?
So this is, I mean, this is one of the things I wanted to get to, but I'll get to already now. For me, even though there's so much that he and I had in common, and we overlapped, and I admired him greatly. As with any kind of paternal relationship, there's also drama and conflict, and I would say that there's some of the things for me, as someone who was kind of moving leftward in my life, started out in a kind of right-wing Orthodox upbringing and kind of moved leftward. I now consider myself a conservative Jew, but at the time I was leaving rabbinical school. I had been ordained as an Orthodox rabbi, and I was moving leftward. And part of what was driving me leftward was feminism and the desire to include women in ritual and other endeavors within traditional services. And so I was moving leftward at a time when I think you could say, especially relative to the overall arc of his life, he was at a point in his life where he was moving rightward. He left the seminary. So he left the seminary in 1985. He left. What had happened at the seminary was Saul Lieberman, who is probably the greatest Talmudist of the 20th century. I don't think you'd get much disagreement, at least on this side of the world. In Israel, you might get some disagreement, but that's because there's just, territorial bias. But Saul Lieberman was at the Jewish Theological Seminary from the 40s up until his death in 1984. And during that time, he was the unquestioned religious legal authority at the seminary. So there were other rabbis who weighed in on legal issues, and the conservative movement has a more complicated and complex voting system for how legal change happens. But institutionally, for something as big as ordaining women rabbis, the institution was not going to go there while Lieberman was there, because Lieberman was conservative small c conservative on this issue. When Lieberman passed away, it created a kind of vacuum in religious political leadership in the institution, and the institution decided to make the decision about women rabbis through a sort of majority vote of faculty and staff. And Halivni felt that the institution should be making the decision on the basis of religious legal argumentation, and that the only people who should really be able to weigh in on that are people with religious legal capabilities. So he asserted that his issue was really primarily with the process rather than the specific merits of the case. And I would say later in his life, the synagogue that he eventually came to be rabbi of in his really late career. I mean, he became a pulpit rabbi in his 80s. But you know, the synagogue that he eventually led was after he left it, the leadership was transferred to a woman. And so even though this was a kind of modern Orthodox / right-wing conservative service, he was part of the transition from him to a woman who was not yet ordained as a rabbi, but was taking over rabbinical duties. So I'd say, like, yes, he was, he left over those issues, but I think it's kind of complicated. But he, let me go back. So I used to marvel at, because one of the things that I provided for him between 2000 and 2005 was I was like the tech support guru, because while he could handle basic email, like writing a text back and forth, if you remember the old Unix-based email systems that we started with that were running Pine, I don't know if any of you remember those things. He could handle that, but when it switched to a Windows-based visual thing where there was like more going on the screen, he couldn't handle it. And the notion of attachments just threw him. He couldn't figure out attachments, opening attachments, adding attachments. So this is kind of what I had to do for him. In addition to various other things as his formal teaching assistant, I was also the person hanging around his office, helping him when there were computer problems. But I sometimes would marvel because I would talk to him. There was one time when they were filming the movie Spider-Man on campus, and they had a big crane, and there were vehicles. They had like Model T kind of vehicles on campus because they were trying to make it look dated. And then there was a big crane. They had an actor that they were a stuntman, I guess, like sort of swinging around off this crane. And Livni shows up to class one day, and he looks around, and the class has about 20 students in it, but only 8 or 9 of us are there. He says, "Where is everyone?" And we say, "Oh, they're watching the making of Spider-Man." What are you talking about? He had walked by it, walked by the whole thing, hadn't noticed it at all, because he had tremendous powers of concentration and a tremendous memory, which I will get to. So he was always kind of like lost in thought, thinking about the Talmud passage that he was working on and trying to come up with a solution for it. I also kind of wonder if he didn't notice that those were period cars because he grew up in a world that didn't have cars. So, and he never learned how to drive. He didn't have a car himself. I don't know that he noticed different ages of cars or things like that. Once in passing, he referenced to me that, he didn't have telephone growing up. He didn't have like kind of basic, I think his village didn't have paved roads. One of the famous things about his village, Sighet, is it's also the childhood home of Elie Wiesel. So 2 of the most prominent Holocaust survivors in terms of their literary productivity come from this same town. Wiesel and Halivni were not friends in childhood, but Wiesel knew of Halivni because Halivni was reputed to be a childhood genius already at a very young age. So he came from a broken home. His parents got divorced. His father couldn't support the family, and the family moves in with his maternal grandfather. And his maternal grandfather was a learned man, kind of yeshiva-trained learned man, who basically studied with him and recognized really early that this was someone of tremendous gifts. And in that Eastern European culture, if you had tremendous gifts, there was only one kind of education that you were going to get. That was a Talmud education. He started studying Talmud at age 5. By age 11, he had gone through the entire Talmud and had a memory of where everything in the Talmud is. He famously got one of those pin tests. So a pin test is a test. Now, there are different iterations of this test, but the pin test that he was exposed to was one where they would, the Babylonian Talmud has a kind of standard look to it. Every page has a kind of standard look. You got your commentary on the side, you got your text in the middle, and you got hundreds of pages of the same thing. So a pin test is when someone says, tractate Menachot, that part of the page, what's it about? Right, page 60, what's it about? So what it tests is it tests the recall of Talmudic text. In my childhood, again, I grew up in a kind of on the border between modern and ultra-Orthodoxy. In my childhood, I encountered other people who had been exposed to this kind of test. The people who I encountered who had the ability to do this were often, I guess nowadays we would say they're on the spectrum. They generally had photographic memories. And what they could not do was what Halivni could do with this ability. So I don't know at what point he developed, at a very young age, he knew the Talmud by heart. But in addition to that, his grandfather studied the Talmud in a proto-critical way. And I'll get into a little bit more about what that means. But his grandfather, even though they were living in a traditional culture and they were Hasidim, he grew up in a branch of the Satmar Hasidim. So if you know much about Hasidism nowadays, the Satmar are the most extreme right-wing Hasidim, the ones who are anti-Zionist and anti-Israel. They are mostly housed out of Williamsburg, and but this is in terms of his family and his upbringing. This is where he grew up. He grew up in a kind of world was a branch of the Satmar Hasidim. Despite the fact that Hasidim in history are generally known, accurately so, as anti-Talmudists, part of Hasidism, part of what motivates the rise of Hasidism in the 19th century is a feeling that this kind of overwhelming focus on elite education in the Talmud is misplaced. And it doesn't give people in general religiously meaningful inspiration, right? So that's part of the rise of Hasidism, is connected to a critique of Talmudism. But by the time we get to the 1920s, much of that had already dissipated. Much of the anti-Talmudism of the Hasidim had already dissipated. If you're following what's been going on in New York with the Hasidic schools, those are mostly Hasidic yeshivas, and yet they're talking about how much they're motivated to teach Talmud, right? So this is ironic in light of the history of Hasidism, because Hasidism was anti-Talmud. But already in the late 19th century, Hasidism and Misnagdism, which is the oppositional movement that rises to oppose Hasidism, they kind of make peace with each other. Nowadays, in ultra-Orthodoxy, you can still see residually, families will still identify themselves as Hasidic or Misnagdic, and you can see in the wardrobe choices and other kinds of certain basic legal interpretations, differences between them. And certainly there are differences in liturgy and custom, but fundamentally in terms of education, there's not much difference. They're both in the pro-Talmud camp. I would say in the same way, even though Misnagdim, part of Hasidism is also fueled by a rise of storytelling and wordless music, the singing of nigunim, kind of meditative, transporting experience of music. Again, by this point in our history, Misnagdim sing as much music as Hasidim, and they enjoy a good inspirational story as well, right? So a lot of the things that were the hallmarks of the things that divided this schism in the 19th century are no longer the case. So when Halivni was young, he was trained to be a Talmudist in a Hasidic milieu by a grandfather who happened to have kind of critical leanings, not university educated or anything like that, but had critical leanings, which means that he was familiar with some of the literature. His grandfather was familiar with some of the literature of the Haskalah. The Haskalah is the Jewish Enlightenment, often associated with its founding figure, Moses Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn famously leaves his German village and marches to the gates of Berlin in the 18th century, and sort of gains entry into Berlin and becomes highly educated in German, in philosophy, and becomes a member of high society, interacting with all the great philosophers of his day. That was Mendelssohn. And Mendelssohn brings, in the aftermath of Mendelssohn, you get the Jewish Enlightenment. And one of the ways the Jewish Enlightenment expressed itself was in historiography. So before there were university professors who were going back and retelling a kind of non-religious Jewish history, there were already religious Jews in the 18th century and the early 19th century who were revisiting historical questions. And that's the kind of literature that Professor Halivni's grandfather was familiar with. And so already in his childhood, he was understanding that there are important historical questions behind this literature. By the time he was, so at 15 or 16, he was taken to a camp, taken to Auschwitz. He actually was in a labor camp that is adjacent to Auschwitz. And he tells some fascinating stories about those experiences. Talks about, he has a famous story that he tells about a guard eating a sandwich in a wrapped up piece of paper that was a discarded piece of Shulchan Aruch, a piece of paper from the Code of Jewish Law from Yosef Karo that was written in the 16th century. That is the foundational text of Jewish law, and how the inmates begged the guard not to throw it out and to give them this piece of paper, and they basically would sit around this one piece of paper that they have, and this was their canonical text. They had no other religious books. And he talks in another place about the experience of how there was a cantor who wrote out the High Holiday liturgy from memory, and they sang the Rosh Hashanah service, and he talks about how it was he couldn't get into the room because as like sort of the youngest person there, he had no priority, and so he sort of stood outside and prayed while they. So he has a very different. His memoir is really valuable. I highly recommend it. The Book and the Sword. Talks very, very frankly about all kinds of things. So he comes to the United States after the war, and he ends up in Brooklyn. None of his family survives. All of his immediate relatives were killed. His grandfather, of course, also, but his mother, his siblings. None of them survive. He ends up in Brooklyn. He ends up going to an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva, Chaim Berlin, which is a very prestigious ultra-Orthodox yeshiva. But it's not a good fit because he has too critical of a mind. And through, he liked to tell this story. He at some point in the home for displaced persons that he was put in, he started making trouble with the person who was supervising the kosher regulations. And they he started asking rabbinical questions. And so one of the women who was running the institution wanted to kind of put him in his place, was friendly with Saul Lieberman, who I mentioned before was the leading rabbinic scholar at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and said, "Oh, I'm gonna bring, if you don't trust me, I'll bring in Saul Lieberman." So this is how Halivni met Lieberman, and in Lieberman he found someone who was a match both for his critical thinking as well as for his diligence. In the story Halivni likes to tell about his meeting of Lieberman, when they met, because they were meeting about debates about the kosher certification of his kitchen in the home that he was living, they ended up in a scholarly debate around the questions of the combinations of meat and milk, which are covered in Tractate Chulin of the Talmud on page 97, thereabouts. And at some point in their conversation, Halivni corrected Lieberman in a mistake. Lieberman had said something about a text on Chulin 97, and Halivni had corrected his memory of the text. And as he was leaving, Halivni sees Lieberman take out Tractate Chulin from the bookshelf, and he opens it to the first page, Daf Bet, because the Talmud always starts on page 2. And Halivni asked him and said, but the thing we were discussing is on page 97. And Lieberman said, if I forgot something on page 97, I probably forgot something on page 2 also. I have to start from the beginning. So this, I mean, the level of diligence in terms of Talmud study is hard to imagine. If you haven't studied in a traditional yeshiva, it's hard to capture. I will tell you, based on my own experience, I spent 10 years studying Talmud in advanced yeshivas, but only 3 of those years spent studying Talmud exclusively, right? In 7 of the years, actually, no, let me take that. Yeah. In the other 7 years, I always had something else going on curricularly. I was working on a degree of some kind. But when you study Talmud in a like pure traditional yeshiva and you are religiously motivated, you can do crazy things. So when I was those 3 years that I was in yeshiva without getting other degrees, I was studying something like 16 hours in a day. So I had 3 prayers a day, I had 3 meals, and the rest was just Talmud study. And I wasn't getting a tremendous amount of sleep. And this is how people like Saul Lieberman and David Weiss Halivni, this is how they operated for long periods of time. And it explains how Halivni was able to produce his life's work. His life's work is a set of books called Mikorot u'Misorot, literally translated sources and traditions. I'm in my office, so I have all the volumes behind me somewhere, but I'm giving you the images on the slide for ease. So just to give you a sense, he published the first volume of this in 1968. The 9th volume was published recently in 2019, and he was working on it when he passed away. There's going to be a 10th volume that's coming out that scholars are going to reconstruct from his notes that he left behind. This is an incredibly ambitious project. He covers about 80% of the Talmud. So the Talmud is massive and it's vast. And the thing about it also is it's incredibly dense. To study the Talmud in the way that someone like him studies the Talmud, every time you're opening up a Talmudic text, you are looking at every parallel source in other works of rabbinic literature. So we have another Talmud, the Palestinian Talmud. We also have other works of rabbinic literature, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, other works of Midrash. You're looking at those. You're also looking at all the medieval commentaries. So you might be familiar with Rashi and Tosafot, the medieval commentaries that are on the side of every Talmudic page. But those are just 2 of the medieval commentaries. Most tractates of the Talmud have upwards of 6 Talmudic commentaries on each tractate. And but in addition to that, the Talmud was the centerpiece of study for such a long time because it did all kinds of cultural work. It was the foundation for all the subsequent codes of law. So Maimonides' Mishnah Torah is built heavily on the Talmud. So you could use Maimonides' Mishnah Torah as a commentary on Talmud. Every statement in Talmud is cross-indexed in Maimonides' Mishnah Torah. The Code of Jewish Law that I mentioned, Shulchan Aruch, is similarly indexed to the Talmud. But there's also, in addition to the codes, there's also the responsa literature. Responsa were answers to specific questions that rabbis got over the years. It started out as a system during the Gaonic period between the 8th and the 10th centuries, when there were these academies in Babylonia. People would write their rabbinic questions to their academies in Babylonia, and then the academy would take up the question and it would come up with an answer, kind of like a Supreme Court, and then it would publish the result and it would send it out. And we have all these, we have hundreds of these responsa from the Gaonic academies, but this project of responsa writing continued after the Gaonic period. was something that individual rabbis did. Usually distinguished rabbis would do this. And so there's this vast responsa literature that also digests the Talmud. So there's a tremendous voluminous literature of reception. If you're interested in more of details of this, my book, The Talmud, a Biography, overviews like all of this stuff. So if you're interested in this. After the medieval period, there were post-medieval authorities who strove to write commentaries on the Talmud. I'm not sure there is another post-medieval commentary that covered as much ground as Halivni covered in his commentary. I have to like debate this issue, but the point is like his ambition to write this commentary of the Talmud is really unheard of for his day. I mean, he's really something out of history. Like this is something that my other teacher, Shama Friedman, who together with Halivni is often credited with some of the important discoveries of how the Talmud works, which I'm going to get to on the next slide, he has a different approach. Friedman's approach is he works very specifically on small bits of material. He will focus in on a single chapter of Talmud, and he will account for every word in that chapter. But because of that, Shama Friedman has only covered 3 or 4 chapters of the Talmud. Halivni, by contrast, has more of a cherry-picking approach. He's not going to account for every word. He's trying to account for the things that really bother him in the text. So it's more selective, but he's covering much more ground. And the reason why that matters is for students of the Talmud, while Friedman's method is in some ways easier because he teaches you exactly what to do on every page, how to drill down and explain, to use his style of learning. I see your hand, Doug, I'm going to call you in a second. Well, Friedman does that because he hasn't gotten to everything. You don't have the ability to just consult what does Friedman say about this passage. But because Halivni's covered 80% of the material, a lot of the times if I'm struggling with something, I'm trying to make sense of this thing that doesn't make sense, I can look it up in Halivni's commentary because he got to it. Yeah, Doug.
Oh, 2 questions. So you mentioned here the first 9 volumes cover 80% of the Talmud. Was his vision or dream to complete everything, and he just, the book work was slow and the years crept up on him, and will the 10th volume finish it? That's question number 1.
No, the 10th volume is, truth is that the early volumes are much larger. Like the early volumes cover, like each covers like half of an order. He was slowing down productivity wise. He was slowing down as he got older. So some of the later volumes are smaller, and the last volume is going to be very small. He
slowed down, got older.
The amazing thing about it is, I mean, I knew him and was in conversation with him for, I don't know, 25 years or so. And during the first 20 years of that, he was completely there in terms of intellectually and his abilities. And when he was completely there, what it meant to be him was that 80% of your day was on this project. Like he was always in a text. He had the text open. He was always thinking about it, or the computer was open. He was writing his latest insight into it. And then at a certain point when his faculty started to go, you could see him he was still trying to do it, but it took too much out of him. And so he wasn't as productive. So the family is kind of dealing with this in terms of the last volume is not as well done as the earlier one. So they're going to have to figure out exactly how to supplement it. Yeah, Riva.
Well, question number 2, if I may.
Oh, Doug, sure.
Just so wouldn't you say that you mentioned no one else was done this from the medieval era to Halivni, more or less, but what about the Neusnerians and Neusner and all his students? Didn't they pretty much complete a
So they
comprehensive?
translated the Talmud, but they did not do a commentary.
Oh, okay.
There's a big difference between a translation and a commentary. When you're
Yeah.
translating, you're just representing what the words say. You're not explaining what the logic is, and you're not also, I mean, what commentaries like Rashi are doing is they are dealing with all kinds of logical flaws in the material as they're commenting, right? So that kind of level of engagement is what I'm talking about.
So I'm sorry, so the Newsner thing, Project Life was just to translate the Talmud and put it in English so people would read it in English?
I have a lot to say about this, and I don't want to get super
Okay.
distracted. Newsner himself, you know, Newsner published like thousands of things.
Yeah.
Newsner made tremendous contributions, but they were not in the in-depth study of rabbinic literature, right? So it was more, his contributions were more about rabbinic historiography, like what we can say about the rabbis as a group. And he also introduced a kind of skepticism towards how people read rabbinic texts that goes beyond the skepticism that Halivni himself introduced. So Halivni introduced a kind of skepticism, which I'll get to, about what the texts mean, like a kind of distrust, like you kind of have to read behind the text to see what's going on in the way the text is being manipulated. Newsner was a much more radical skeptic and said, well, we can't trust the text at all. And this opened up a whole new area for doing rabbinic historiography, but in terms of reading the text, in terms of grappling with the age-old questions of how the logic of the text works, it doesn't really add to it at all.
Okay,
Riva?
thanks.
So you would probably only get this question from a woman. Starting as a young man and all that studying and all that time that he put into it, did he marry and have a family?
He did marry and he had a family.
How did he have time?
And I wasn't around when his kids were young. So I didn't see, I will say that I was around when his wife, who was also a survivor and a scholar, developed Alzheimer's, and it was very, very tough on him. She would get lost in Manhattan. She would run away from her handler, and like people would, call him, and he would drop everything to go and find her. So, I mean, he was definitely a devoted, and he loved nothing more than talking about his family. His son Shai, who is a friend of mine and who probably will listen to this at some point, probably won't mind if I say that sometimes it did seem as though the kids lost their father to the Talmud Project. I would say that it's true of many of the people in the generation of my teachers and their teachers, especially in cultures like the Talmud culture, which is a very homosocial environment and one that focuses on productivity. There is almost a push against family life. It's not even so implicit in the Talmud itself. There's the famous example of Ben Azai, who says he's not going to get married and have kids, and the other rabbis say, but you have to. It's legally required. It's a mitzvah. And he says, I don't care. My soul desires Torah, right? And like and that there still is that legacy within rabbinic texts. And I mentioned Saul Lieberman. Saul Lieberman and his wife never had children. And I sometimes think that Lieberman might have been happy about that, because it allowed him to continue to be this like super productive, like never leaving the study hall till midnight rabbinic, and there wasn't that same kind of pull on his time. But it's true. Going back to the Vilna Gaon, it's probably like the most famous modern rabbinic figure who gets celebrated for all kinds of things, rightly so, incredibly brilliant, insightful textual scholar. If you dig into his biography, his family life was terrible, just awful. I don't think Halivni was that, but I would say that like many of the men in the generation before me, there is no doubt that his wife deserves a lot of the credit for enabling his ability to focus as much as he did. And that too has a legacy going back to the Talmud, with the famous story of Rabbi Akiva, whose students Rabbi Akiva, who acknowledges after he gets venerated by the students, famously in the story, he says to the students about their scholarship, he says, what's yours and what's mine are really hers. So this is a kind of problematic gendering of study in the Jewish context that goes back all the way back to rabbinic literature itself. So I hope that answers your question, Reba. Okay. Among Halivni's English language books are these four here: Pshat and Drash, Midrash, Mishnah, Gemara, Breaking the Tablets, and Revelation Restored. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about his theology later, where the theology comes out in Pshat and Drash, Breaking the Tablets, and Revelation Restored. When the New York Times published an obituary of Halivni, they offended me a little bit with this kind of, I don't know, half statement about his theology. Professor Halivni was considered something of a theologian, right? So this is not a writer stating Professor Halivni was also a theologian. This was considered something of a theologian. I might unpack that a little bit more probably next week. But you'll notice also, like, his obituary at the top, it says David Weiss Halivni, controversial Talmudic scholar, dies at 94, right? So it's controversy is the first thing about him in the obituary, which I don't know that he would have minded. But I want to explain now his major contribution to the study of Talmud, and that's what I have in mind with anonymity, the anonymity of my title. So just by, I guess, a show of hands of the people I can see, have we all studied Talmud? Riva, no? Jerry, no? I'm not saying Jerry's frozen, I think. Jerry, yes, no?
Rabbi Noble used to run a Friday morning Talmud
Okay.
class.
So the question is, who wrote the Talmud and how did they work? So the tradition has answers to these questions. According to the traditional understanding, what is the Talmud? Talmud is a set of oral minutes of rabbinic conversation. 6 generations of rabbis in Babylonia were conversing about the Mishnah and other Tannaitic materials that were left out of the Mishnah, the Braitot. They talked to each other about them. And what the Talmud is, it's the oral minutes. And the tradition acknowledges that even though the Talmud presents itself, it's kind of, I like to show my students the Raphael painting from the Renaissance School of Athens, which has all of the great figures from the classics, like in one room, as if they're in one school, even though in some cases they live centuries apart. And in many cases, they certainly never would have been in the same space. But it's an idea of classicism, this idea that Raphael is going for, that all of these great classical thinkers are really in one space. The Talmud is a literary version of that artistic view. It puts all of the great rabbis of Babylonia, and even the ones of Palestine, of Eretz Yisrael, of Israel, they puts them all in one space in the literature. It makes it seem as though they're in dialogue with one another, even though first-generation rabbis are not in dialogue with third-generation rabbis, certainly not in a way where the first generation can respond to the third generation. They're not present when the third generation produces its ideas. So but attentive readers of the Talmud notice that actually most Talmudic passages don't violate chronology. They usually go in order of chronology. So the Mishnah, the first voice on the Mishnah will often be a rabbi from the 3rd century, someone like Rabbi Yochanan or Rav and Shmuel. And then the next voice will be a rabbi from the 4th generation, someone like Rava or Abaye, someone who's from the transition from the 3rd to the 4th centuries. And then after that, you'll get someone who's maybe a student of Rava, like Rav Papa, a 5th generation rabbi, or Rav Ashi, a 6th generation rabbi. People who are more solidly in the 4th century. So usually in a Talmudic passage, no two Talmudic passages are the same. But in a Talmudic passage, they generally honor chronology. But despite that, the overall sense that you're getting is that there's a cross-generational conversation happening throughout time between rabbis who lived in the 1st century and rabbis who lived in the 5th century. According to the tradition, the last layer of the successive generational layers was contributed by 2 specific figures, Ravina and Rav Ashi. These are Amoraim, these are rabbis. The rabbinic literature is divided into 2 stages. The Tanaim are the rabbis who are old enough that their material could have been found in the Mishnah. And the Amoraim are the rabbis who are not old enough that their material could have been found in the Mishnah. And because of the impact of the Mishnah as a work, there evolved this sense that the later rabbis, the Amoraim, the ones whose work whose ideas didn't end up or couldn't have ended up in the Mishnah, were not as authoritative or did not have as much authority as the earlier rabbis. So by the time you get to the Talmud, there's a layered canonical conversation happening where a 4th generation rabbi, in talking about a statement from the Mishnah, does not feel comfortable saying, I disagree. They can't flat-footedly disagree with the Mishnah. They believe that what they can do, though, is they can find a competing view from the same period as the Mishnah and hold that up as a basis for disagreeing with the Mishnah. They can use it as a stalking horse to say, I'm not disagreeing. I, the 4th generation Amora, I'm not disagreeing, but I remember this position from this rabbi who wasn't in the Mishnah, but is from the same age as the Mishnah, right? So according to tradition, and there are lines in the Talmud itself that seem to indicate that these 2 rabbis, Ravina and Rav Ashi, were the kind of crowning editors of the Talmud, that they kind of sealed it, that their generation is the last layer, and that they are responsible for editing the Talmud. They are to the Talmud what Rabbi Judah the Prince is to the Mishnah, the sort of acknowledged editor. So what does Halivni do with this? How does Halivni intervene here? Simply put, Halivni says the Talmud was not, could not have been, was never edited by Ravina and Rav Ashi, right? So controversial point, right off the bat, historically, he just does not, now, why is this the case? First of all, because you have material in the Talmuds, and significant material that postdates them. They can't be the editors of the last layer if the last layer includes arguments made by their children and grandchildren, right? So I mean, like Rav Ashi's son, a number of Rav Ashi's sons actually end up in the Talmud. And then Rav Ashi's grandsons end up in the Talmud. So how could Rav Ashi be the final editor of the Talmud if his grandchildren's material ends up in the Talmud? More significantly, there is a lot of material in the Talmud that is editorial. So while the Talmud is this conversation across multiple generations of rabbis, it generally attributes the conversation to named rabbis. Rabbi so-and-so says this, Rabbi so-and-so says that. And if you've studied Talmud, you're familiar with this. This is a ubiquitous feature of the Talmud. But in addition to the fact that it attributes things to named rabbis, it also has unnamed sections where it's just talking in a narrator's voice, and in a kind of anonymous editorial voice. This editorial voice, if Ravina and Rav Ashi are the editors of the Talmud, then this editorial voice should represent them. It should be them. But it isn't. there are time and time again, Halivni goes through the entire Talmud and shows you all over the place where the editor will take things in a completely different direction than either Ravina or Ravashi, contradicting them in fundamental ways, sort of fundamentally rereading or differently reading earlier material than these two rabbis do. So one of the things that emerges from Halivni's work here, therefore, is that the traditional model of thinking of the Talmud as just a set of minutes that are kind of loose, just a loose recording, like a tape recording of meetings that happened with no editorial intervention is not right. Actually, if you do the work that he's done on 80% of the Talmud, you come to the conclusion that there is a much stronger editorial hand than the tradition likes to acknowledge. That editorial hand is evident in the anonymous editorial layer of the text. And it's evident in a number of ways. One of the ways has to do with citations, what citations mean on their own, and what citations mean as they're used by the Talmud's editors. So I mentioned that the Talmud is a conversation around the Mishnah that incorporates rabbinic materials that were circulating in the rabbinic ether, attributed to rabbis who were contemporaries of the Mishnah. So rabbis who were active in the 1st and 2nd centuries. They produced things as midrash, they produced alternative brightot, like legal positions that are not captured in the Mishnah. In addition to that, the 6 generations of rabbis who are the Amoraim, the 6 Amoraic generations, they also sometimes produced new legal ideas as dicta. They sometimes, just like the Mishnah is a set of dicta. This is a statement of law. This is if you're going to blow the shofar, you have to blow this number of blasts, right? Statement of law. This is a ritual legal requirement. Often the Mishnah has it as a debate. This number of blasts, Rabbi so-and-so says half as many blasts, or whatever it is. This is commonly the way the Mishnah works. The 6 generations of rabbis after the Mishnah didn't stop legislating in this way. They continued to produce dicta. They continued to just make legal statements about things. We're going to see an example of it. And the thing is that often there's a gap between the original statement and what the original statement meant to the person who was uttering it, and the way the statement is now employed in the context of the Talmud. The editors, and this is for a number of reasons. Some of it is because they are creating a collage and they're bringing these different citations into contact with each other. That itself kind of shifts what the original statements mean. It gives them a new context. So now they mean something else when contrasted with somebody else's dictum. Sometimes there's a clear agenda there where the editors are actually trying to drive the ideology, drive the law or the ritual in a new direction. Sometimes they'll be very aware of the fact they're kind of misreading the earlier material, but they're doing it for a specific reason because they're trying to get to an ethical value or something. So there's a gap between citations and how they're used. This is a major difference between reading critically and reading traditionally. Traditional readers do not acknowledge this gap. They do not spend time thinking about what the original citation of an Amora like Rava really means and what the text does with it. And I'm going to give you an example of exactly this in a minute. The other piece of it is, in terms of the stronger editorial process, if you've ever studied the Talmud, you might be familiar with the fact that the Talmud introduces citations with signposts. Our rabbis teach, or the students of the yeshiva asked a question. Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis teach. The students of the yeshiva asked a question, Meitivei, right? So these are signposts. If you actually had a live conversation, nobody would have to give, they're kind of like script instructions for actors, right? But they didn't exist. They're not just innocent minutes. They're part of the framing of the editors of the text who are putting these texts into conversation and making it look like there's active conversations happening. Often we can tell that they've created a dialogue out of texts that were originally not a dialogue at all. They were just kind of loose statements floating around. So there's a lot of work going on in the editorial process. The anonymous editors were referred to by Halivni as the Stamaim. Stam means anonymous. And the medieval commentaries, sometimes in emergency situations, out of necessity, acknowledged an editorial hand in the Talmud. And they would refer to that editorial hand as the Stam. So when Halivni came and wanted to sort of focus on this, he borrowed this language from the traditional medieval commentaries. The difference, though, is that while the medievalists would use the Stam as the sort of last resort option when you can't explain the text's problems, maybe there's a gap between the Amora and the Stam, Halivni uses it as a methodology to read every passage of the Talmud, right? So the medievalists did this occasionally. He was doing this universally. He also says that these Stamaim, he hypothesized that these Stamaim are later than the 7th generation of rabbis. So they're later than the generation even after Ravina and Ravashi, and have a fluid relationship with the Gaonim who come after the Talmud. So one of the things Halivni was always doing in his work, up through my last conversation with him, where he could still talk about these things, every time he would study a Talmudic passage, he would come at it with such excitement and the smile on his face, it was amazing. And Barry would say, I just read something and it changes everything I've learned before. He was constantly updating his theories of Talmudic editing and changing his notion of chronology and dates. If you look his student Jeff Rubenstein actually published his introductions to Mekorot and Mesorot. His introductions to his commentary are where he would distill the insights he was getting from the commentary in terms of like global questions of who wrote the Talmud and when. And a few years ago, his student Jeffrey Rubenstein worked with him to translate all of those introductions into English. And so they're available in English. They're now a book called The Formation of the Babylonian Talmud, which I didn't give you a picture of. But you can get from that book, you can get a sense of like how he worked and what kinds of questions he was looking for to answer some of these things. But you can see how this is a major intervention in the field, a transformative intervention. And through his work and the work of his counterpart, Shama Friedman, whom I've mentioned before, the study of Talmud has been drastically transformed. That is true on the academic level. Of that, there is no question. I would actually argue it's also true on the non-academic level. There's ways in which I think their model of active editing has seeped into traditional ways of reading the Talmud, where traditional readers don't even realize that they're getting a more active notion of editing than people used to get 2 generations ago. So in the translation projects, if you go on Sefaria and you look at the translation of the Steinsaltz edition, I'll show you in my translation that I'm going to give you right now, in this passage that I'm going to show you. So I'm going to stop the share and share something else. In this passage that I'm going to show you, the way the Steinsaltz and also the Art Scroll personify the anonymous voice of the Talmud as the Gemara. The Gemara says. And I think in some ways that's always how it was done. Okay, I'm going to start. In some ways, that's always how it's done, but I feel like there are slight differences now with there's a greater personification of the editorial voice that's happening even in traditional circles because of Halivni's work. Yeah.
So if you don't mind, what's the time era of about maybe the sixth generation, the seventh generation, or the stam?
Yeah, so this is where we get in trouble. And I was
Sorry.
actually called out. I was called out on this in my book, for my book, The Talmud as a Biography. The Talmud a Biography, one of my colleagues called me out on this in the Jewish Review of Books in his review of my book. It's kind of, the whole thing is kind of silly, right? So the problem is this. There are 5 generations of rabbis whose work populates the Mishnah. And we generally say the Mishnah was written in 200 or composed orally in 200 CE. And we say the 5 generations of rabbis whose work populates the Mishnah were active between roughly 50 CE and 200 CE. So 5 scholarly generations covers 150 years. That's reasonable because it's basically saying 30 years a generation, which is reasonable in our world. It's a little unreasonable in the ancient world because people died much younger. But I can accept 30 years as a generational thing. The problem is that when you get to the Talmud, most histories of the Talmud say that there are 6 generations of rabbis, and they stretch in time from 200 to 500. So they say that they stretch in time from, that each generation is covering 50 years. It's not possible. So in my book, The Talmud a Biography, I tried to create much more reasonable standards. So I think I did something like first generation is 200 to 230, second generation is 230 to 260. I tried to sort of keep going with the generational model of the Mishnah. The problem is that what ends up happening then is then your Talmud ends earlier than you want it to end. Then the Talmud ends at like 400. And the problem is that our historical record picks up again well in the 8th century, around 750. So if we can't fill out, if you push the rabbis to 500, then between 500 and 750, not knowing what's going on there feels better than like saying the rabbis ended in 400 and we have 350 years that we don't want to fill. But part of the work that Al-Livni is doing is trying to fulfill this gap. Because we don't, so within the traditional historiography, the kind of Haskalah historiography that emerged out of traditional historiography in the 18th century, they often referred to this period between 500 and 750 as the period of the Savoraim, like another period between the rabbis and the Gaonim. But we have no materials from the Savoraim. So it's kind of like, so Al-Livni came along and he said, maybe the Savorim are really the Stamaim. And maybe in that period, they weren't really actively producing their own works because they were editing the Talmud. And so much of his work is like playing with, like his changes in dating are playing within that time frame. Like between 500 and 750, where are you going to put the editorial work of the Talmud? So in his different introductions, he's kind of going back and forth between those dates. Yeah, Jerry?
It's very interesting that you use Livni's explanation while you have this screenshot up with regard to interpretation as to what you can consider and what you should not consider. And it seems that the explanation you've just given us for this gap of 2.5 or 3 centuries is such that it might fall within the teaching of this Makot that we shouldn't consider it. It's I don't think it's any more reasonable than, I mean, it makes some sense, but it might make as much sense as the flying camel reference at the bottom of this.
Okay, well, Jerry, you've read ahead, which is fine, but I want to make sure everyone's on board before we discuss this Makot text. And I also want to introduce this text so that everyone's following along as we talk about it. So this text I have here is a text from Talmud Tractate Makot, which is a tractate that I love. I did my my online class, my MOOC, which is available on Coursera, is on this chapter of Makot. Makot is this chapter of Makot. The first chapter of Tractate Makot is about false testimony. when witnesses lie in court and what happens to them. And specifically, it's very much focused on the biblical injunction not to do so, and the biblical punishment that if you do lie in court, the punishment that you get is you get exactly what you want, what you intended to do to someone else, right? So there's a quid pro quo that you get. What was supposed to be done to them is now done to you. Now, the Mishnah is a scholastic text that introduces legal ideas through hypotheticals, and often rather outlandish hypotheticals, though the outlandish hypothetical that this passage is going to get to is not something that it goes beyond even what the Mishnah does. So this is coming off of a Mishnah that is itself dealing with the following problem. The Mishnah was talking about, I mean, according to biblical law, as understood by the rabbis, Deuteronomy 19 says that in court cases, you have to have a set of witnesses, not a single witness, but a set of witnesses. You need to have two witnesses. So you always need to have a corroborating witness when they're testifying to something. And the question is, what constitutes a set? Right? So like the Mishnah is already dealing with questions of like, what if like 6 people see something? Is that a set, or do they become 3 sets of 2? Or what if like a set includes people who are disqualifying of each other, right? If you see something with your brother and that sibling relationship disqualifies you according to rabbinic law from testifying together and being a set, does that like what happens if siblings see it with other people? Can they split up and become different sets, or does the fact that they saw it as witnesses, as sibling witnesses, disqualify them? So this is what the Mishnah is dealing with. So we get the following dicta from Rava. Rava is the most often cited rabbi of the Babylonian Talmud. He's a 4th generation rabbi, so by my estimate, that would place him somewhere in the middle of the 4th century. But other people like to place him later and say he's around the beginning of the 5th century. But again, debates about this. Rava has this case. If two witnesses came and said somebody, or John Doe killed the person to the east of a building, and 2 other witnesses came and said to the first set, but were you not with us to the west of the building at that time, right? So okay, let me go back. According to rabbinic law, the way you can establish a set of witnesses as perjuring, as lying, is if a second set of witnesses comes along and doesn't contradict them in terms of the facts of the case. Doesn't say we were there and we saw the opposite of what you saw. Reuven didn't kill Shimon or something like that, right? If the first set of witnesses comes and says Reuven killed Shimon and we saw it on X day, if the second set of witnesses comes and says Reuven didn't kill Shimon, we were there on X day, that does not perjure the first set of witnesses. The only way that you can perjure the first set of witnesses is if a set of witnesses comes and says, you couldn't have seen Reuven kill Shimon on X day because you were with us on X day in a completely different location, and there's no way you could have seen what you claimed to see. Right? So that's what the Mishnah had established as the perjury rule. So Rava comes along and Rava says, he is creating new dicta. What do you have? You have a case in which the original witnesses are claiming that they saw something happen to the east of the building. And the second set of witnesses comes and says, you couldn't have seen what you claimed to see because you were with us on the west side of the building. What Rava has essentially done is he's come up with a hypothetical case that hews closely to the linguistic formal requirement of the Mishnah's perjury rule. And right, so in some sense, it's exactly what the Mishnah is saying. Like if a second set of witnesses comes and says, you couldn't see that because you were with us elsewhere, that makes the first group perjured. But Rava adds and says, well, we don't just accept the second one's testimony and say that the first ones are perjuring. We actually do the empirical work. We go and do a site visit. Judge Denlow, I don't know if you ever did any site visits.
I did one.
Right, so we do a site visit. If people
Very rare, very rare.
if when people are standing to the west of the building, they see to the east of the building, these witnesses are not conspiring. You go and you see, like, could you actually see from the point that they're claiming they were standing what had happened? And if you can, then they're not perjured, right? Now, we don't have the context of Rava's original statement. Well, we can just take this dictum out of the context of the Talmud as it is, and we can understand what Rava is doing. He has seen a Mishnah, and he understands that the Mishnah opens itself up to a hypothetical that seems to formally meet the criteria of establishing the first set of witnesses as perjuring, but it doesn't, but it may not actually be factual. So he says it's not about the format, it's not about the formal ritual utterance of what the second people say. It's about the factual thing. Could you actually have done it? He then says something very similar, and as if you skip down to the next, and Rava says, he has another example. If two witnesses came and said, so-and-so killed the person in Sura, which is a city in Babylonia, in the morning on Sunday, and two other witnesses came to court and said to the first set, you couldn't be there on Sunday because we were with you on Sunday evening in Naharda, in this other city. Again, it seems like it meets the formal requirement of establishing the first set of witnesses as perjury. But Rava says there's fact-finding here. If one is able to travel from Sura to Naharda from morning until evening, they are not conspiring witnesses, as conceivably they could have witnessed the murder in Sura and traveled to Naharda by evening. And if it is not possible to travel that distance, they are conspiring witnesses. Now, in the Talmud as we have it, both of these dicta are followed by a question and answer provided by the anonymous editor or the stam. And both times, it's asking the same question. In the Aramaic, the question is pshita. And in the English, it's the Gemara asks, isn't that obvious? Right? So both of these Rava dicta get responded to by the anonymous editorial voice of the Talmud with the question, isn't that obvious? The reason why, I mean, on one level, it is obvious. Right? I mean, if you just think that the Mishnah is about establishing sort of facts, then why would you ever think that because they said west of the building and the other one was on the east of the building, like unless it actually contradicts, it doesn't contradict. So on one level, it is obvious, but the way I laid it out for you, it isn't necessarily obvious because law has all kinds of ritual formulae where if you follow the ritual, you can come up with absurd scenarios where it might be legally true, even if it's factually untrue. So from a historical perspective, it is most likely that when Rava said what he said, he was doing it to preclude exactly that, to preclude some kind of someone who would read the Mishnah and say, if you follow this formula, then you can establish perjury, even if it's not factually true. But by the time the anonymous editor is reading Rava, they have a different standard for any rabbinic utterance. They believe that a rabbi would not clear that rabbi's throat and say something unless it had added value that could not be inferred from prior statements. There has to be some kind of legal ramification. There has to be something that it's coming to preclude or add. Otherwise, they wouldn't have spoken. Yeah, Doug? You're muted, yeah.
So, but about the timing and when did the stam live and all that stuff, particularly in the second case, the implication of the, if you could get there in a day, it's not contradictory, implies that they don't know how far apart those towns are. And less picky in that they can't visualize the exact building and how it was constructed. Could you see from the west to the east? That might require a site visit. But if they all live in Babylon and they're all Talmudic scholars, unless they don't get out much, wouldn't they know the answer to this question? It isn't. It if you live there, you know the territory, it's obvious. If it's not obvious.
I don't
you
know. I don't know how often they would have traveled from one place to the other, and I don't know how often they would have traveled urgently. They wouldn't necessarily know that there's a flight leaving at O'Hare and you can get there in X amount of time. Like that's from our perspective, this seems obvious, but these cities were fairly far apart. Like also, I doubt that many of the people, these also could have just been sort of randomly thrown out examples where people have actually no knowledge of these particular cities. But if you notice in both cases, what the Talmud's anonymous voice ends up doing is it creates a rather ridiculous straw idea that Rava's idea comes to preclude, right? So the Gemara answers, lest you say, let us be concerned about the possibility that these witnesses have particularly good eyesight, and we're able, right? So do you have to, right? So essentially what Rava is teaching in the first thing, according to the anonymous voice, is Rava is coming to some kind of reasonable man standard, right? What the law would say is a reasonable man, that you don't have to like take into account the possibility that something completely unreasonable might have happened and they were able to see beyond what a normal person would be able to see, right? So this is a way that the anonymous editor is taking Rava's original statement and making it legally meaningful, but beyond the intention of the original statement. I mean, there's very little likelihood that Rava's original statement had anything to do with this reasonable man standard. That is entirely added by this editorial voice. But this kind of thing is ubiquitous in the Talmud. I gave you this example because it's very easy to see the sort of extremity of it, but this is ubiquitous in the Talmud, and it's sometimes more subtly done than this. But basically, the editor is constantly sort of pushing you in certain ways. And what Halivni's approach allows you to do is it allows you to create gaps between Rava's original understanding and the editor's intervention. And those gaps now become possible ways of doing all kinds of historical work, of saying, well, maybe by the time you get to the editors, there are different animating impulses. In terms of legal history, it's incredibly valuable. There's a scholar named Leib Moskowitz in Israel who has a book called Talmudic Reasoning, which kind of unpacks the kind of logical implications of this and shows how the Talmud becomes more conceptually abstract over time. And that's all building on Halivni's sort of fundamental insight in the way that the approaches to law change within the generations of the Talmud. Yeah, Jerry?
You asked earlier whether Mort had ever done a site visit. A similar situation would exist with regard to a judge's jury instructions. I can imagine a situation where the jury's deliberating and comes back with a note to the judge. What do you mean by reasonable doubt? You know, if we come up with a hypothetical that could explain this, does that create doubt? And the question is, it's got to be a reasonable, within this general worldly experience that makes it reasonable. It can't be something that may be based on some kind of extraordinary or speculation that somebody had X-ray vision and was able to see through the building or something. It's got to be within your reasonable experiences to have that doubt. And that's what this text seems to be, is a form of a jury instruction to assist on this dilemma of eyewitness testimony.
Yeah, I mean it's a scholastic text, so but you're absolutely right. I mean, in that sense, it's a kind of clarification in the same way that a jury instruction can be in a clarification. The thing about the second example in this passage, do you have to worry about right? So again, isn't the second one obvious? Can you get from one place to another? And they say, let us be concerned about the possibilities that the witnesses traveled on a flying camel, right? This is entirely fantasy, and it gets to the level of absurdity, It's a kind of ridiculous expansion of the law. In fact, one could argue that the anonymous layer is a much more absurd layer than the earlier rabbinic layer of the text. So we find this kind of, and part of why you end up in this moment of absurdity with the flying camel is because there's a kind of literary thing going on where the response to the first dictum worked and sort of made sense literarily. So when they go and they edit the second one, they're trying to match structurally exactly what they did in the previous one, but you end up in a kind of ridiculous situation of like, maybe you should worry about a flying camel. I mean, really, are we really meant to think that, you know, that prior to Rava, someone would have thought that there was a more concern about a flying camel, and then Rava comes along and teaches us that you don't have to worry about a flying camel. It's just about whether you can get there from one place to another. Like, but it's partly, we become aware of how the Talmud ends up in a kind of absurd situation because of the way it's interpreting earlier material and trying to make that earlier material respond to a different standard that it wouldn't necessarily respond to. What's driving that is that the later editors have some idea that Rava has to be adding something new, something that we wouldn't have known by inference before, rather than what he probably was doing, which was interpreting the material that he had in front of him to try to make sense of it, even if in some ways it's just unpacking the obvious, but it's kind of laying out what that means for the reader. It's sort of, by the time you get to the anonymous voice of the Talmud, they no longer accept that a fourth generation rabbi would be engaged in the practice of just unpacking what the Mishnah says. That seems to them like not worth their time.
When was it converted from oral to writing?
So the Talmud was produced as an oral document, and it was transmitted orally exclusively into the 9th century.
So
and then at some point in the 9th century, they start writing it down. Yeah.
So when we have these later, people, are they looking at a written document, or are they unpacking it orally?
Orally.
Okay, so
Unpacking it orally.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that they were doing it orally, research on Talmud has shown that they actually could do with their oral texts more or less everything we can do with our written text. I mean, their sense of the text and their ability to sort of have the text in front of them orally is something that's hard for us to imagine.
Very, very hard to comprehend. Very hard to comprehend.
Okay,
One
so
last
I'm going to
question
stop
bef-
here. I'm going to stop here.
Can I ask one quickie before we adjourn?
What?
Was the Mishnah written down on its own before the Talmud?
It's a very controversial question. Current state of research is no. The Mishnah was not written down until around the same time the Talmud was written down, 9th century. I say controversial because Saul Lieberman had a different view. He believed that there was a written copy of the Mishnah that was secured away somewhere for safekeeping that was not generally used, but might have been occasionally consulted, but was not read out of. But the Israeli scholar Yaakov Zussman, who's a slightly younger contemporary of Lieberman, has written a very extensive disagreeing piece where he thinks there was no such thing, that it was all oral until the 9th century. But these debates get really heated. Okay, I look forward to seeing you guys next week.
Yeah, okay. I won't be with you next week. I'll have to get the recording.
Okay, we'll miss you.
Okay, thanks.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.